one of the mods in my Twitch channel, Torvar, passed this off to me last night. A lot of white supremacists seem to have an Asian fetish on Vice's YouTube channel. Let's take a peek. I'm still never going to get over that tiki torches have become yet another ridiculous shoehorned symbol of white supremacy, like the OK sign and milk and cartoon frogs. Thank you, 4chan.
If you've seen footage from the Charlottesville protest, you might have noticed something a little strange. Chris Cantwell, who's a white supremacist, has an Asian tattoo. The tattoo's a little slappy, but it's supposed to be the Japanese character for truth.
Could it be that the tattoo isn't sloppy, but that he's in motion so you can't really get a good look at it? And actually, looking at it again, it doesn't seem sloppy at all. It seems like it's in that traditional brushed style, rather than a modern typeface. It might seem like I'm nitpicking here right off the bat, but Vice's reporting, if you can call it that, has a tendency to put quite literally everything it can into the most negative possible framework it can muster. This guy's tattoo being sloppy or not really doesn't matter, but it's one small hint of many showing that Vice wants you to think of this guy negatively. And trust me, there's many reasons to think of Chris Cantwell negatively. This kind of tactic is only really necessary if your story is otherwise weak.
And it's actually not that strange.
Whoa, can we comment on this for a second? What is with that hair? Vice, you can't just throw this shit at me and expect me to accept it. This motherfucker looks like Mac from McKids. I always thought the flat top haircut to just be a joke of the 90s, relegated to Guile and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I never thought I'd actually see somebody try to pull it off IRL.
White supremacists love Asia, especially Japan.
He doesn't even fit into the frame properly because they have to fit his tower of a hairstyle into it.
And every well-known white supremacist in recent memory seems to have some kind of weird Asia fetish.
This is actually true, from Andrew Anglin's Asian girlfriend to Richard Spencer posing at a weeb convention with 3 Asian trannies. The alt-right does have an obsession with what they like to call degeneracy. I've always said a room full of cute traps and cat girls can absolutely destroy the alt-right all on their own.
Everyone from former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, to far-right Norwegian extremist and mass murderer Anders Breivik, to Charleston shooter Dylan Roof, have all raved about the virtues of East Asian countries and praised Japan as a model to follow.
I'd guess that the alt-right likes Japan because Japan is a technologically advanced, relatively successful ethno-state. That isn't Jewish, of course. Never mind the fact that Japan's birth rate is rapidly declining, far faster than the rest of the world's, and that they face extinction within 100 years. A society's reproductive level is inversely tied to things like technological advancement, creature comforts, education, and so on. I think that the alt-right has deluded itself into thinking that their hypothetical society wouldn't somehow end up exactly like Japan's, withering away due to their own excesses. I don't like this state of affairs, of course, but it's not immediately obvious what to do about it, and the alt-right doesn't seem to have an answer at all.
So what gives? Why do racists like Japan so much? Well, the short answer is, they view Japan as a mono-ethnic utopia, which is exactly what they wish the US was.
You know, hair aside, this guy's not too far off the mark. The big problem with comparing Japan to a hypothetical white ethno-state is that Japan isn't a race itself. It's an ethnicity within the larger Asian race. White is not an ethnicity, it's a race. And because racial boundaries are not at all strict, it becomes a lot harder to have an ethno-state based on a race. It's a dumb idea, in other words.
Here's how Richard Spencer puts it.
It's wonderful being in Japan. It is an ethno-state. Japan,
Pika-pee.
whatever problems it might have, does not have the problem of diversity, and therefore Japan can truly be a homeland. It can be a home.
This is why I'll never agree with the alt-right. Richard Spencer is worried about superficial things, like how people appear. I feel at home where I live, and there's a lot of non-white people here, but they all came to Canada to be Canadians. They might have different accents. They might look or dress a bit different, but they uphold Canadian values where it matters. I'm not in a part of Canada that views Canadian disgust at the third world's barbaric practices as racist. I know that in Toronto, things have gone to absolute shit in that regard. But having non-whites around isn't an automatic death sentence. Also, what the fuck were you doing in Japan, Richard? You're not Japanese.
But it's a little more complicated than that. It's not just that white supremacists love Japan, it's that they have to love Japan.
No, I'm pretty sure it's because they're all closet weebs.
There's a precedent for this in Nazi Germany.
Oh god, let's stop pretending that today's alt-right has any meaningful connection with Nazi Germany, alright? The alt-right's a bunch of fucking losers, with no political power and no actual vision of the future, aside from what you might see on a Fallout pre-war advertisement.
By the early 1900s, Japan had become powerful enough to pose a military threat to some European countries, which in turn poses a threat to the idea that white people are inherently superior.
That's not what happened. Let's just keep going.
So even though Adolf Hitler personally didn't like Japan very much, publicly, he had to say that he respected the Japanese.
I don't know about that, good sir. Adolf Hitler was one of the world's first weebs. There's a reason Nazi symbology has its roost in East Asian mysticism. If Hitler were around today, he'd be rubbing his deformed dick against anime waifu pillows just like the rest of us.
Fast forward to today. The economic success of some Asian countries poses an intellectual quandary for even the most sophisticated Reddit troll.
No, it doesn't, because trolls aren't actually racist. They're trolls. They say racist shit to get a rise out of people like you. And hell, looking at that dome of yours, I think they succeeded.
Even things like college acceptance rates for Asian Americans kind of throws a wrench in the whole white superiority idea.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Maybe you should stop acting like whites are somehow superior to you then, and stop yammering on about white privilege or reparations or whatever the fuck.
So some modern white supremacists have gone even further than Hitler did, and don't just tolerate Asians, they actually idolize them. That's why white supremacist Jared Taylor told a Japanese news crew, in fluent Japanese because he grew up there, that blacks and Latinos are inherently inferior to whites. But he also said that Asians have higher IQs than white people. When he was asked for details, he just said, that's biology.
Thankfully, Jared Taylor is no expert on these matters, and we can dismiss him on those grounds. The data does show Asians to have a higher average IQ than whites, and whites to have a higher average IQ than blacks. But just as idiots like Taylor jump immediately to genetics, idiots like you jump immediately to oppression, systemic racism. You're two sides of the same coin, looking for a simple solution to a complex problem. Also, you can pin the blame on somebody you hate and garner those victim bucks for it.
Now, the quote-unquote science behind studies that support this sort of thing has been pretty roundly debunked. And there's no evidence that homogeneity equals success, whether that's in Japan or elsewhere.
Homogeneity probably doesn't equal success, sure. But it does equal stability. And even then, it doesn't necessarily need to be homogeneity of race. Homogeneity of culture will do the trick. Most people do not care about your skin color. They only care if you act like a decent person. Stop making it about race.
But white supremacists keep blindly worshiping Asians.
It's pretty easy to do with the amount of Asian porn out there.
Because if they don't account for them somehow, then the whole ideology starts to fall apart. It's also pretty convenient, and pointing to successful Asian people allows you to argue that racism doesn't exist, and that any socioeconomic problems that blacks or Latinos face is because their culture or their DNA is inferior.
Obviously not DNA, but I think it's reasonable to say that yes, their culture is inferior. European cultures value hard work. Asian cultures value hard work. Jewish culture values hard work. Can you guess the racial makeup of the most successful individuals in society? We can judge a culture by what it produces. And if it produces ghettos and gangs and inner-city crime, or parental abandonment and drug use and exploitative prostitution, or religious extremism and terrorism and sex slavery and genital mutilation, we can judge that culture to be morally bankrupt. And that says nothing about individual members of a race that is traditionally associated with that culture. Barbaric practices are not a racial quality, but they're still not any less barbaric just because a minority race follows them.
But really, it all comes down to what people do when the way they look at the world is challenged. Some people take a step back and say, hey, maybe something else is going on here, like maybe racism or structural inequality. And some people just get a Japanese tattoo.
Or a cultural race to the bottom that you should be looking inward and finding a solution to, instead of blaming white people for not wanting to work with hood rats. There's always fucking that. Both social justice warriors and the alt-right like to conflate race with culture. The alt-right believes that if you're a member of a race, then you must follow a culture assigned to that race, and you personally embody all the negativity and backwardsness that culture is known for. SJWs, meanwhile, believe that if you criticize the barbaric practices of a foreign culture, then you're committing a racist act against the race that that culture came from. We have to reject both of these points of view in favor of allowing the individual to stand on their own merits. This shrine to hairdressing perfection, Dexter Thomas, has been writing race-baiting shit like this for years now. He and his tube-like head also somehow won a fucking Pulitzer Prize for his writing. Yeah, he really seems to be a virtuoso here. Alright, I've gotta go. Enduring this BS was enough to make my hair stand on end.
And I know you're aware of this, but there's a lot of black people who feel like what you're doing is selfish.
It's kind of a manufactured frenzy and controversy that got stirred up in 2015, right? By the white media, the white parents, the white police. You know, like those are the people that instigated that controversy.
So basically you're saying this is basically, black people being mad at you is a white conspiracy.
Based off of a white narrative about me. There's still this sense of like a score needs to be settled. You know, we still haven't had reparations. We still haven't had like this healing, truth and reconciliation kind of
If
stuff.
we had reparations, would you be getting a check?
No, I'm not. I don't actually identify as African American. I identify as black.